So this is the final Sunday of the Easter season, and we are getting ready, lectionary-wise, for Pentecost. Pentecost is often referred to as the birth of the church, the coming of the Holy Spirit in the sense of empowering those who follow Jesus to God, ultimately became Christians. And so this week is pointing towards what is to come. And it uses John's gospel to do this. Now, the people who put forth the lectionary focus on this prayer of Jesus in John's gospel that is focused on the disciples themselves, because the disciples themselves will be the ones who start the church, inspired by the Holy Spirit. I want to, however, point out that this chapter in John's gospel, chapter 17, is the conclusion to what we refer to as the Last Supper. And John's gospel has a very elaborate, very detailed, lots of words from Jesus' Last Supper. Rather than just simply, this is my body and this is my blood, sharing the breaking of the bread, we had Jesus washing the feet of the disciples, saying that you are called to serve one another. And you do this not because you are the slave and they are the master, but rather that we all together are to be one in God's love. Again and again, we hear different images that point us this way. Love one another as I have loved you. Abide in my love. I am the vine, you are the branches. We get metaphor after metaphor on how we are to be the community of God. And Jesus is directing all of this to his disciples. And in this last section, chapter 17, he prays. And he prays in 3 sections. We only have the middle section. The first section of chapter 17 is a prayer for Jesus himself. It essentially asks for strength to carry out the final leg of his journey, which of course leads to crucifixion and the cross. It's as if to say and acknowledge that Jesus does indeed follow through, even to the risking and ultimately being killed. And that we acknowledge what Jesus did in those actions. Now, the second part of the prayer is focused on his closest disciples. And the lectionary readers intentionally want us to be included in those disciples. You are the ones going forward. And this lays the groundwork for the church going forward, which Pentecost is about. So it's pushing us towards Pentecost. And it does so by talking about joy being made complete. And it also does this strange thing about us not being part of the world. Now, I want to be very, very clear here. We are to care greatly for God's creation, the world. But the world that Jesus is talking about is the world as is, as the values that are being put forth by human society, which is about dominance and about the acquiring of wealth and power and all those things that Jesus has been actively opposing in his life. That type of activity is not our calling as those who follow Christ. So in that sense, we are not to be part of that world, but rather focused more so on what God hopes for us all, what God hopes for creation, what God hopes for the world. And I love the inclusion of Psalm 1 here. Psalm 1 says, those who have not settled in walking in the counsel of the wicked, or lingering in the way of sinners, or sat in the seats of scornful, will be like trees planted by streams of water, bearing fruit in due season, leaves that do not wither. Everything they do shall prosper. The vision here is that we will be fruitful and care for God's world and one another. That is the prayer that Jesus essentially says for his disciples. And then there's that third part of the prayer of chapter 17, which is not included here because it's talking more universal about those who will join the journey and ultimately gathering everyone. And the key thing that it says that it will gather everyone in unity in love. Now, unity in love does not mean we will all understand the world the same way, or that we will think the same way, share the same convictions about everything, but that we will be united in love, which was the whole point of last week's love one another as I have loved you. So the overall message, before we get to the being of the church, which Pentecost focuses on next week, is that if we are grounded in God's love and loving and caring for one another, we will be able to go forward and face all the difficult things and tasks ahead. That is the hope for the church and the hope for the world. And it's good news. Thanks be to God.